He's a recognized leader in the space. He's a go-to person for all things medical cannabis in Canada and increasingly around the world. I'm honored to be here to have this conversation today. So Dr. Ware, thanks for being here.
Thank you very much.
So clearly we have this big picture view of what's happening, and we have heard from esteemed guests on the panels today. But I really want to talk about me. I have chronic back pain since May, and I wanted to see if there's anything we can do about that.
Well, we need a full physical examination, right. So if you want to go backstage.
Right. Well, you're going to see this. By the way, he just billed for that. That's Canadian medicine. I'll give you my OHIP number in a moment. I'm actually not kidding. We can talk later. But we've heard from regulators throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, and we'll hear from more today. And we've been through, in many respects, much of the regulatory process here. But from your perspective, why is making cannabis medicine different and apart from making pharmaceuticals, or is it?
So great question. I think there are probably elements of pharmaceutical drug development that apply very similarly to cannabis. If you extract the active molecules from the cannabis plant, THC, CBD, the various, and there are hundreds of compounds in there which are potentially pharmacologically active, and you isolate them, purify them, they can be turned into a pharmaceutical medicine, and already have. There are compounds already produced as synthetic THC, it's called dronabinol, it's licensed as a pharmaceutical medicine in the US, in many countries in the world. So synthetically manufacturing one compound is a kind of strategy to pharmaceutical development. The challenge with cannabis, as we tend to think about it as the flower, as the herb, is that it's a complex mixture of many different compounds, and trying to standardize all of those to the rigor that the normal pharmaceutical industry requires for a medicine is extremely challenging. It's one thing to standardize one ingredient. So now that to do 2 ingredients, and then you talk about 3, 4, 10, a family, and people talk about this entourage effect, the idea that in the cannabis plant are multiple compounds all working sort of in a symphony to work on a particular condition, it becomes very, very challenging to produce that on a pharmaceutical grade. So you start thinking about other forms of regulating medicines, natural health products, even over-the-counter products, other herbal medicines like St. John's wort and arnica and other things that people are using. They're not regulated in the same way as pharmaceuticals. So you're looking for different pathways to regulate cannabis.
And that actually leads me to the second question. This comes up a lot in the context in Canada, the way the regulatory environment is set up. And it's this balance between evidence, which I think would speak to the sort of the pharmaceutical component you talked about, and actual patient experience, or the plural of patient experiences or experiences. Talk a little bit about that as it relates to the regulatory framework, as it relates to doctors talking about this, as it might relate to new markets thinking about a new regulatory environment.
So I think it's really important to recognize that, particularly in Canada, but I think in other countries around the world, the reason why we're having conversations about medical cannabis in particular, and recreational, let's park that a little bit further down the road, but for medicinal cannabis use, this is a force that's being driven by patients or people asking for access. In Canada, it was court challenge after court challenge after court challenge over 20 years that built a program that shaped the regulations that we have today, to the point where we have licensed cultivation, we have quality control standards. None of that was in place when the regime began, but it was forced by patients who would take the government to court and win almost inevitably, and force options, additional supplies, raising the THC level, allowing for different forms of cannabis to be available, and so on. So it's been a continuous back and forth, but it's patient driven, and I think it's probably true in many other countries where medical cannabis policy is being it's either by some sort of plebiscite or some form of voter initiative or a ballot initiative in the US. This is a consumer-driven market. It's not something which the pharmaceutical industry woke up one day and discovered cannabinoids and said, we're going to develop a whole new cannabis medicinal thing. They're trying to play catch-up with this advancing front of popular opinion. And that popular opinion is informed by by experience. People are discovering for themselves, they've got back pain, somebody says, hey, you know what, try a little spliff, and they go and they do it, and they go to the doctor and go, you know what, or, well, speak for yourself. But the idea being that they're going to their doctor saying, you know what, I know I'm on anti-inflammatories, I'm on opioids, I'm on anticonvulsants, I'm on antidepressants for my chronic pain, and someone gave me a joint and I smoked it and I felt amazingly. I've never felt like that before. We hear this story all the time, and this is true for Crohn's disease, for anxiety disorders, for you name it. There's hundreds of conditions where these anecdotes, these experiences are being reported by patients going to their doctor saying, can you give me access? And of course the doctor, as we heard from the previous panel, doesn't know anything about cannabis. They've never been taught it in medical school. They don't know what cannabinoid, they don't even know how to say cannabinoid properly. You did perfectly. I was listening to that.
Practicing for like
cannabinoid.
a week.
You know what? And they don't know about the endocannabinoids. They're not prepared for this conversation. So the evidence that has to come along is what the doctors are saying. Well, yeah, fine, but show me the clinical trials. And then you get into a discussion about the history of cannabis prohibition and how difficult it's been to get access to standard materials, to run trials, the stigma of cannabis. I mean, I've been doing this for 20 years, and I was called a pot doc for the first 15 of those. It's only now that I get called all these wonderful things. For the first 15 years, I was a bit of a weirdo. But because there's a challenge to doing this. You study cannabis, you're considered a little bit odd. But now people are recognizing this is a legitimate, genuine scientific inquiry. The endocannabinoid system is remarkable. The possibility and therapeutic applications for cannabinoids are remarkable. We just have to sort of bring that experience that the patients are telling us with the scientific method that we have to explore and understand medicines and bring them together. But this is creating some remarkable new methodologies. It's a very exciting space.
Is there a historical parallel that a patient-driven effort like this? Because it really is patient. I think it's even we've seen the number of doctors who are authorizing medical cannabis in Canada go up over the past year, 2 and 3. But is there something is there a parallel to this in your knowledge, that patients pushing doctors to act in some specific way?
There might be. I'm not aware of it. Certainly nothing in recent history, and certainly nothing on the scale that we're seeing with cannabis. Cannabis is actually remarkable because it's an entirely new class of compounds. This isn't something that, we've had opioids for generations. We've had, different anti-inflammatories and steroids and other classes of medications, and they've been widely used. But the idea of a cannabinoid class of drugs is completely new. And I think that's really transforming the way people are thinking about managing disease. Big Pharma is still circling around this building, watching carefully, but they're not not ready to dip in yet. But they're watching to see what happens when companies like ours start to develop clinical trials, start to show signals that using standardized quality controlled products in the right trials with the right designs, you can start to see signals. That's when they'll start to pick up the ball. But until then, patients are still struggling for access. They can't wait 5 years for a new drug to be approved. They can go and get cannabis down the road. Mm-hmm. How do we merge these two access and research pieces together? That becomes really interesting.
Yeah, I want to talk a little about that because on 2 fronts. One, and I want to see if from a practitioner perspective or even from the sort of canopy growth perspective, that we had a seminal moment here in Canada on the legalization front where adult use recreational cannabis became legal last October. Again, not from data, but from anecdotes that we hear, that this actually opened up a lot more people to be open to the medical side of things. And people say, well, now that it's legal, the stigma is driving down, more people seeking medication. And we sort of talked about it in the previous panels here, but do you think that has had that has caused a mindset shift among patients and or doctors among how they think about medical cannabis?
I think that October 17th, 2018, as a point in time, was very, very significant. There was obviously a palpable change in policy, and that was major. But I think people have to remember, especially people coming from other jurisdictions, is that this discussion has been coming in Canada for a very long time. Over the 2 years prior to legalization, there was public consultation. It was in the news, in the media, on a fairly regular basis, at a fairly high level. Should we do this? Should we not? The voices were coming out for and against cannabis legalization, the risks, the possible benefits, the medical associations, the nurses, everybody was coming out. So there was a huge dialogue. And I think it's that countrywide discussion about cannabis that has been what really changes people's perspective. You know, the moment of legalization was kind of, everyone woke up and was like, it's legal now, okay. Big deal, so we can go and buy it. But it wasn't really a transformative, social movement. There were a few lineups and there were some shortages. That's really been the only major impact we've seen so far. But what has happened is people have started talking about it in ways that they were not doing before. They're talking to their families, they're talking to their kids, their grandparents. People are asking about CBD oils. I mean, CBD, for heaven's sake, it's just become this incredible wave of popular wisdom. And that's all fueled by this level of discussion that we're having around cannabis that prior to legalization, I think, was kind of happening in the back corners and in family dining tables, but not in the public domain where we're seeing it now.
Yeah, and that brings up another question, because from what we often talk about in the business of cannabis and the folks we talk to a lot is that Canada has this unique opportunity now that it's legal, and it's been legal federally on the medical side for a long time. This would be a prime place to do research, right? The clinical trials you talked about that'll bring the evidence alongside the anecdotes or the sort of patient experience. How have you found or how have others, you and others, found the landscape here in Canada in terms of doing the types of research that you want to be doing? Has it changed recently? And are there places that could be doing it better here or elsewhere?
So I think what's happened in Canada is you see a lot more physicians, academic, clinical scientists, basic scientists coming forward and saying, we're interested in this thing. We get, as soon as they start to dig a little bit and see how exciting it is, they want to be involved. It's now becoming a hot topic. There's some increasing funding, which always gets scientists excited when there's a little bit more funding available. So they'll start going after it. So it's raised a lot of interest among the scientific and clinical community in Canada, for sure. The problem is that in order to run a clinical research program in Canada, you need to have a lot of pieces all lined up in a row before you can begin. Approvals of the drug process, the drug itself. You need to have regulatory approval from Health Canada. You need to have a license for the site to be able to practice it. You need a research ethics board to approve it. You need a massive number of documents. This is standard clinical trial stuff. It's not unique to this field, but it has meant that there have been delays. So Canada is not as far forward in this process as I think we should be. There have been delays, and Health Canada faced a huge surge of requests for research licenses to be able to run these, which is a good thing because it means people are trying to do the studies. But it's a bad thing because they got overwhelmed and they're still digging through that pile and trying to get licenses. So a lot of studies are held up because of these license issues. Now, overseas, it's very interesting. We have programs that we're running in Latin America, in Chile, in parts of South and Central America. We have programs in Australia, South Africa, and it's very interesting to see how different regulators approach what they require for a drug to be used in a clinical trial. And I think that's something that global regulators should be thinking about as an opportunity to be part of or supporting this research front that's moving, making it somehow possible without reducing quality, without reducing the rigor, but making it feasible to do the research. That's going to blow open the whole story. And that will allow researchers to start going, well, let's go and run our trials here, Czech Republic, Chile, South Africa. If the regulations are favorable, that's going to be a huge driver. Canada has a huge opportunity to be out in front. I think there's still a lot happening. The US, surprisingly, with some of its farm bill, some of its CBD programs, is actually stimulating a certain amount of research that you don't hear a lot about, but it's not as repressive as you might think. But I think these are the opportunities that regulators have. Create the landscape to allow research to happen, and it will surely follow.
Can we go to that exact point, actually, and you use the term digging through it. I want to talk about CBD for a second, because it came up on a previous panel. It seems to be like the safe ways for the US, for example, right? They passed the Farm Bill. Now hemp is grown literally in every state. How far away is the talk to the research? What that disparity between the hype and any evidence-backed component to it, how far away are we from that? And what's the disparity between
So the
those two?
big gap for CBD is clinical research. CBD, cannabidiol, has been known for decades. And it was Brazilian researchers, actually, who were the first to start to identify how CBD could be useful. And they ran clinical trials in anxiety and epilepsy in the early 80s. So it's not new to the scientific and clinical community. It's been around, but there was no interest in pursuing CBD as a therapy at the time, for intellectual property reasons, probably for investment reasons, and the stigma around cannabis was such that it just wasn't something that was being pushed forward. But with the discussion that's happening around cannabis in general, CBD has been constructed as the safe cannabinoid. It's the non-psychoactive one. It doesn't get you high. I mean, you see this stuff written all the time. CBD is considered to be the safer of the two major cannabinoids. And that's based on predominantly preclinical research, stuff that's been done in the lab with animal studies. And it's true that the animal work shows anti-inflammatory effects, anti-anxiety effects. I mean, it's remarkable. It's an incredible compound if you just look at its pharmacology and its basic science literature. The gap comes when you try and put it into the clinic. With the exception of a small number of clinical trials, there's nothing to support CBD as a topical for different conditions. Everyone's rubbing it all over their head, their beard. Probably,
in fairness,
CBD beard cream. There's a product.
I didn't have a beard this morning.
But it's kind of reached this mythological proportion where it's good for everything. And of course, with that comes a lot of investment in companies that are producing CBD products without any regulation, without any testing for the true level of CBD in the product, without any backing up for the claim that's being made, if any, on the product label. All of this, I think, has to be cleaned up. And it needs to be done quickly because people may. CBD hasn't been used in the same level. THC, oddly enough, we know quite a lot about. It's been used, predominantly by people for decades. CBD is a new thing. You take 1,200 milligrams of CBD a day for the next year. I can't say with any degree of clinical certainty what the risks on your liver or your brain or your kidneys might be. We need to be careful when we embrace something new like this, thinking it's safe, but blowing it wide open. I think we need to be careful.
Yes. Thinking about this from a sort of government perspective or regulator perspective, is there a time when you see governments investing in the research here or elsewhere? And what ought governments be thinking about in that context of funding research?
Yeah, good question. Government, I think, probably predominantly plays a role in creating the rules to allow the research to happen. Probably a role for seeding money for pilot studies, for grants to get people going, labs to start working. And this is what the CIHR, the Canadian Institutes for Health Research, has done in Canada. It's, seed funding, $100,000 grants to get labs, to get teams organized, to start the discussion happening at the scientific level. But the big trials, to do the big proof of concept, the big efficacy claims that you would expect for pharma, these are tens, hundreds of millions of dollars in investment. I cannot see the role of government doing that. That's the industry that has to invest that kind of money. And for the industry to do that, it needs to have confidence that it's going to have its material protected and it has an opportunity to make money at the other end. It has to have a favorable environment in which to invest in the research, good quality researchers, good quality labs for testing. It needs to have a population that's open to the idea of doing research. It may sound silly, but you open up a trial, think everybody's going to rush in. You may find it's quite surprising how few people enroll for a trial when you actually open the doors. It's the biggest problem in clinical trials is enrollment. So you need an environment where it's favorable to running the clinical trials. So what government can do, facilitate, stimulate the research, open the doors to it, and then let the industry step in, or nonprofit sector. I mean, there are lots of different models for this. We're seeing in psychedelic research, nonprofit companies coming in. So it's not just about industry, but there's clearly, so someone's going to invest $100 million in a research program, they're going to want to see their product on the shelf with a claim and a medical prescription capability, and that will return the investment in spades. Mm-hmm.
I want to ask a more personal/professional question for you. This has been something you've done for a long time. You talked about being called a pot doc for a decade before you stopped being called that, I guess, unless people still call you that.
I'm sure they do.
But is it rewarding, interesting, not surprising, I guess, I don't know, whatever, take a word, that the world is caught up to where you've been for a long time? Sort of thinking about this in real terms, and we're talking to regulators throughout the hemisphere.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually got the idea for me to start the whole cannabis research thing began in Jamaica. I was at the sickle cell clinic in Kingston, Jamaica. I was working in research, and pain is a major problem with adults with sickle cell disease. And we had these patients coming in terrible pain. All we had was, morphine and anti-inflammatories, and we were pumping everybody full of these drugs to try and control this severe pain. And I had this old Rasta man who came in from the hills for his annual checkup, and he must have been in his 70s. It was hard to age him. Rastas don't age the way we do. They look amazing. And I said, what's your secret? And he leaned and he goes, Doc, you must study the herb. And I was like, okay, well, get herb, study the herb, wrote it down in my book. Went back to my office that afternoon and started punching. This is early days of the internet, so this is 1998. So I'm punching in, cannabis, marijuana, pain, and boom, there's all this stuff about receptors and endocannabinoids and THC, and everything I read said, clinical trials needed, clinical trials needed. I went running up to the director of the office and said, Bing, I've got it. We've got to do cannabis for sickle cell pain. We've got the patients. We've got, God knows, enough ganja growing up in the Blue Mountains to be able to run a trial. And that was the beginning of a 20-year journey of discovering how hard it was for political reasons to start doing that kind of work. There were concerns about funding and the perception that, the University of the West Indies didn't want to necessarily be seen to be doing this at that time. Mm-hmm. Then there was supply. Where is it going to come from? When are you going to go? The lead of the unit said, come back when you have a drug, Dr. Ware. So off I went and began the journey. But at the time I saw an amazing path opening up for research. There's a new class of compounds. Untreated chronic pain was still, all we had was basically narcotics. Mm-hmm. And I don't see that path closing anytime soon. I think the potential is incredible. I think we're just now seeing the factors that we need to do this coming into place. But I think this is another 20 years worth of work. This isn't going to suddenly fix itself in the next couple of years. We have to be in this for the long haul. This is a long-term game, and I only see this as, for myself, I'm only halfway through. It's a
Just
long
half?
way to go. Oh yeah.
You're marking, so in 10 years you'll be done, or next 20.
Not going away.
Well, I want to open it up to questions from folks around the room. There are some microphones. Will and Alex have some. What?
I feel like I've been talking to this half of the room the whole day, so I'm going to turn my neck and at least look this way a little bit.
Hi. Can you hear me? Thank you, Dr. Ware, for all the work you done. I'm from Peru. I'm a patient myself. And, we're the patients, we are evidence, as you said, and I thank you that you collect all that information. It's really important. We are using cannabis because it works. It's easy like that. And spite of the doctors and the governments. And we will continue using it because it works, as I say. And it's not only life quality for us, it's life quality for our families and the people that care about us. And I have two questions. Why CBD is like the star, that everyone loves? I know that it's because the regulations are easier, and you can, when you isolate, you can buy, vender, sell, thank you, sell more, and you use more because less potency if you have the whole plant. But why the CBD? If the more studies that we have about THC, and the pharmaceutical products are with THC too. So why? And why they treat THC like anthrax or something like that, when you have these kind of medicines in your house that are really dangerous, and I have many effects, side effects, cause that medicine, the regular medicine, and why THC and a little bit of relaxing and laughing and all that, it's so bad, for people, and you can microdose and everything, and depends, as doctor, that depends of the disease you have. You will need more THC or less. No, the doctor will tell, but why?
Why?
Thank you.
So great questions. First of all, I think CBD is enjoying its moment in the sun now, as I mentioned earlier, because it's the non-psychoactive cousin of THC. And so it's giving people a safe way to talk about cannabis because they can talk about CBD. It's kind of easier and safer to talk about. It's not psychoactive and so all that stuff. So I think that's one reason why. It's easier to produce. I think now we're beginning to see with hemp cultivation and the ease of extraction, it's easier and simpler to extract. THC has historically been the main ingredient in cannabis. So for the last 50 years, most of the recreational cannabis that's ever been grown worldwide is predominantly THC. In fact, you can see over time the strength of THC in cannabis has been increasing as illicit cultivation and cultivation techniques have evolved to allow and maximize the amount of THC in the product. Because it's the psychoactive ingredient, it's the one that causes the euphoric effects, and it's been the one thing that's been driving the illicit market. CBD strains, when the regulations opened up to allow CBD and to allow extraction, it was very hard worldwide to find CBD strains that were high enough to make it worthwhile to extract. So this is a relatively new phenomenon. But why was THC considered so dangerous? Why is it still considered dangerous? The history of prohibition is fascinating. I won't try and go into it here. There's lots of mythology around why and what happened with THC over the years. It is still a strong drug. It's still in high doses. It's associated with mental health issues, with psychosis, with dependency. So I think we have to be careful not to assume that it's entirely without risk. At the wrong person using the wrong dose, we have to be careful with THC. That said, why do people consider unwanted side effects of euphoria and mild happiness and giggling a bad thing if you're suffering with chemotherapy? It is a fair question, but I think people are concerned about dependency. They're concerned about youth perception. They're concerned about the way the population is going to embrace this. And I'll say this: I think it's really interesting that the way cannabis is emerging onto the world stage on the back of an opioid crisis is making people very careful about the fact that for a while, doctors, and myself included, were considering opioids to be quite safe for use in chronic non-cancer pain. They were being prescribed widely. Industry was involved. A lot of the elements that were happening then, which have led to, for one reason or another, a major problem with opioids and mortality, are in place now for cannabis. And so people are probably overcompensating, but quite rightly raising flags and saying, let's be careful that we don't jump on cannabis as if it's the next big, and then 20 years later discover that there was something we should have been looking out for. So I think it's just having that element of caution, and there are good ways to do that when you set up drug programs, good pharmacovigilance programs, good monitoring. All of this is possible. We just need to put them in place.
Great presentation, and thanks to the man for the hills.
I think it's thanks to him every day.
Yes,
He's
but
led the light.
Something that I see the regulators and the healthcare professionals not talking more about, for example, again with THC, if you don't ignite it, it doesn't become active.
Right.
So, I mean, people blend it, people juice it, and you don't have that psychoactive effect. Mm-hmm. So again, that's really just fear in people's psyche, because yes, if you don't smoke it, you don't get high. Mm. So why are we not talking about that?
It's actually really good pharmacology. The cannabinoids in the flower of cannabis in its raw form are carboxylated. They have little carbon dioxide molecules stuck to them, which actually inactivates them, as you point out. If you ingest them in their raw form, they don't bind to the receptors. They don't cause the type of... There's some evidence emerging that these carboxylated cannabinoids may have some therapeutic value on their own, but it has not been studied widely. The juicing, the raw herbal tinctures and extract, we don't know yet how they're working and what the evidence is for these. But you're quite right. You need to heat the plant, not just ignite it, but just heating it, cooking with it, baking it, smoking it, vaping it, all involve heat. Up to a certain temperature, the CO2 molecules come off, and now you have an activated cannabinoid which binds to the receptors, and this is So a lot of medicines that are derived have been pre-decarboxylated. So you take that off before you put it in the oil, then you have an active compound. But yeah, it's something very few people know. You're clearly a student of biochemistry.
Sorry, I just wanted to touch on that because I would have thought that if THC is taken orally, and this is the whole subject of edibles and so forth, that in terms of the first pass, it will be converted in the liver to the hydroxy, which...
An advanced student of pharmacology.
Well.
No, you're absolutely right.
Which has a much more potent effect, a delayed effect.
Yeah.
The onset would be about 2 hours after, and that a person could have significantly higher highs as a result of that. So therefore, somebody who eats, a child or somebody eats a patty laced with THC that hasn't been ignited, that you could still suffer those, you could still have those effects. Now, I'm only bringing this just as a counterbalance to what was just said just now, that you have to ignite it and so forth. What did you think of that?
So most of the edibles, the consumables that are being developed for the recreational market are products that use a decarboxylated form of THC. They've already been heated or treated to make them active. If you only use the decarboxylated flower material and put that, you wouldn't have the same risk. It doesn't go through the same metabolic pathway. It has to be decarboxylated, then the liver picks it up, and you're right, it converts it to 11-hydroxy, which also has some effects. And then ultimately what the liver does is it puts a CO2 molecule back on it, and that gets excreted in the urine. It deactivates it by plugging the CO2 back on, it stops being effective, and that's what comes out. And that's the urine test for THC, is a carboxylated THC molecule. So if the products that are being made for edible consumption that the toddler may get their hands on are decarboxylated, then you're right, the risk of them, if it's a non-decarboxylated compound, then that risk is very, very much lower. They can't go and eat a flower of cannabis. You don't see goats in Jamaica eating the flowers of cannabis. It doesn't have any, maybe they do. I actually don't know if goats in Jamaica eat, but I would suspect that they don't, because they just simply can't get an active, they haven't got the tools to roll it up and smoke it. Yet.
Hi. Doctor, from your perspective as doctor and all your experience in the cannabis, what is your opinion about the other ways for patients to have access to cannabis? And I talk about the auto-growing or self-cultivation, so people growing themselves so that they can use the plant in other ways than the, I would say, medical extraction.
So I think here you get into a question of quality. And if you're talking about a medical product that someone is going to take and use for their therapeutic, whether it's for their pain or for their epilepsy, I think, and it's fairly well built into our culture globally, that you want to have the same thing every time. You're used to having a medicine that contains the same thing every time you need to use it, it's always there. If you're growing it yourself in the backyard of your house, you can allow for a certain amount of, if you have a hot summer or a dry summer, the profile of the cannabinoids in the flower will change. It's a very, very sensitive plant to environmental conditions. So one crop will have high THC, one crop, the same seeds, same genetics, may have a very different profile. You're not going to get the same medicine every single time. So one batch will be effective for you, the next batch may not. So the idea of having a standardized medicinal approach allows for people to use it with a certain degree of knowledge that they're going to get what they need. If you're just talking about recreational use and you wish to have it for your own consumption and you're prepared to take the chance that one year you may have a good crop, one year you may not, for recreation, and Canada has made this move to allow people to grow, and I believe as of this morning, Quebec's court just struck down a policy to forbid home growing of cannabis in Quebec. So right now, most of Canada is allowed to grow cannabis in their home, a small number of plants, but not for medicinal purposes. That's just for you. If you want to enjoy the plant and enjoy it, that's your decision as an adult in Canada. If you want to use it for medicinal purposes, then there's a different pathway which requires standardization, quality control, testing for pesticides and heavy metals and all the other stuff that's in the air. You want to be sure that it's clean and it's high quality. So that's where the separation takes place.
We have time for one more question. Sir.
David Hyde. A quick question, swinging back around really to the focus of this forum, which really is about building regulatory capacity in new markets, Latin America, of course, the Caribbean, and I'd suggest beyond. I guess it's a concern and a question. When you look at how these emerging countries are gaining insights and looking to Canada, for example, and many people probably are here for this reason, and what did Canada do right? What did Canada do wrong? And I've got a bit of a concern and maybe a question for you. Mm-hmm. The concern is when you get the large license holder folks that are helping these countries or moving into these countries, many of whom, frankly, I work with, so I have to be a little bit careful how I couch this point, that are going to give freely of their advice, but have some commercial interests at play. So they're going to give advice that perhaps is couched in a certain way.
Yep.
People come to Health Canada and say, tell us about what's happened here, what you've done well and what you haven't done well. And they might be a little bit prone to put a little bit of rose-colored glasses on that. Then it might not give the real rough edge or really what's happened at the coalface, if you will. So that's kind of my concern. My question to you is, as a regulator in these emerging markets, where do you go? What are the sources that you should look to find out from countries like Canada at a real kind of empirical level, what went right here? What really is working, has met the regulatory objective, and what hasn't? And where are the real problems lying? Because I do fear that in some cases the regulators, the emerging regulators, aren't actually getting the information that would help them to avoid some of the pitfalls that we experience here.
Right. So it's a fair question, and I think to answer it, I'll take off the industry hat and go back a couple of years to the task force when Canadian government was engaged in a huge process of stakeholder discussion, and at the time spoke to Uruguay, spoke to Holland, spoke to the US, a couple of states in the US, and consulted widely with not just industry, but academics, public health policy, lawyers and economists and global health specialists. So I think the quick answer to your question is don't just listen to industry. That for sure there will be a perspective, but expand the search, talk to others. I believe the Canadian government will engage, and I remember when we left the task force and finished our work, we said we had benefited a lot from the engagement with many other stakeholders, and that the government had a responsibility to give back. So as regulators are considering this, I would invite you to, and I will even connect you with the Canadian government and then step away. If there's a discussion, they, I think, are more than happy to share that. They may not stand on the top of Parliament Hill and wave a flag and say, come and talk to us, but I know they're open to sharing that experience. And there you may well find their concerns about what went right, what went wrong, and you'll get a different perspective. I think Canada, generally speaking, is moving forward in a fairly advanced front. We recognize the problems as industry, as academics, and as policymakers. So I don't think you'll see a huge twist in the story from one side to the other, but I think it behooves any good policymaker to consult widely, get multiple positions. But the economic reality of countries wanting to export, wanting to develop industry, wanting to stimulate research, that's going to require a discussion with industry at some point.
I want to thank Dr. Ware. I want to thank the CCAC for putting this on today, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Jay. Thanks very much.
Mark.
Thank you, everybody.